On this programme, we're aiming to explain the obstacles to a ceasefire agreement. With our panel in Tel Aviv, we've got Dan Perry. He's the author of the Ask Questions Later blog and newsletter on the Substack platform. In occupied East Jerusalem, Munir Nusseibeh is a professor of international law at Al-Quds University. And in Cairo, Hafsa Halawa is a political consultant and non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute. Thank you all three for joining us, all three of you. Let me start with a very quick question to each of you, which is how optimistic you are about the chances of a deal. Hafsa, what do you think are the chances that they could get a deal this time in the city where you are, Cairo?
Very briefly, I'm not optimistic. I don't think much of the parameters around a hostage deal have really changed, nor have the sort of entrenched positions on both sides in that regard.
Dan, your thoughts on this? Do you think there is a chance of a deal here?
I think Hamas wants a deal where Israel pulls out of Gaza, essentially capitulates in exchange for all the hostages, and the chances of that are extremely small. Whether they can do a partial hostage release or a temporary ceasefire is entirely up to Yahya Sinwar, I fear.
Munir, your thoughts at the start of the discussion about how optimistic you are there could be a deal?
Unfortunately, I'm not very optimistic because I think the gap is quite big between both parties. The Israelis have set really huge goals for this genocide, and I think that if they don't want to stop it right now.
OK, well, we start from a pretty pessimistic place, having heard all of your initial views on this. Hafsa, let's first look at the mechanics of this. Who is attending? We have the CIA director, we have the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Qatar, we have the intelligence chief of Egypt, and we believe we have the Mossad chief and the Shin Bet chief. And then also you're going to have a senior representative of Hamas, who won't, I don't think, be in the same room as the others. But all of these people have been negotiating for a long time. They all know each other pretty well now.
Indeed, we've had rounds and rounds of these talks, and I think part of what the challenge is, particularly for those sort of non-combatant sides, not the Israelis nor Hamas, is that the terms, the parameters of the deals simply don't change. Hamas's asks remain the same, Israel's asks remain the same, and that daylight, that gap that Munir very rightly pointed out between the two sides hasn't diminished. In fact, if anything, it's entrenching on both sides, and we've reached the point where there is very little understanding of who and how these two parties can meet in the middle to engage in a ceasefire arrangement, in a hostage for prisoner exchange deal that would allow for significant respite in this conflict, or at least, and even possibly leave us to a more permanent state of ceasefire, where we can rebuild some of the aid infrastructure in Gaza, reinstitute and reconstitute UNRWA's activities there as well, because they are the only major aid delivery mechanism, and really begin to try and help the millions of people that are stuck there in Gaza, and do important recovery, as well as return hostages and have prisoners released to their families.
Dan, just staying with the mechanics of this just for a moment so we can explain it to our viewers. We have a senior Hamas official, Khalil al-Hayya, who is in Cairo for these talks. But my understanding, you'll probably know more about this, these are indirect talks. Israel and Hamas don't sit in the same room. The mediators, the Egyptian mediators and Qatari mediators, go between the Israelis and Hamas. Explain to us how you think it works.
Yeah, I mean, yes, Israel and Hamas will not sit in the same room, and it's all a little bit silly and farcical. And I think this is one case where both sides are equally to blame. But that's okay. I mean, I don't think that this is a dynamic where the Israelis and Hamasniks, by sitting in the same room, are going to develop some sort of camaraderie, and that will help the negotiations. So the Egyptians and Americans and the Qataris, for their parts as well, and throughout these talks, have done great work and incredibly important work. Now, I agree with the other panelists. The asks on both sides simply haven't changed. And you need to look at what the parameters are, the variables are, and figure out where there might be some potential for movement. I can only repeat what I said before. A partial hostage release for a temporary ceasefire seems to be all that we can hope for. I know that the Israelis would agree to this, I'm pretty sure. And perhaps more pressure is needed by Qatar and Egypt on Hamas. to do the same. I don't see another way out. Now, there are other variables, including does Israel insist on security checks of the people that they let out of Rafah to go back north to Han Yunis and even to Gaza City? They insist on it. I don't think they're going to give up on them. So I'm not terribly optimistic for these reasons. On the other hand, there is a lot of pressure on the Israelis to the Israeli government from within Israel to find some way to do a deal. That is true. That is true. And indeed, there has been talk of Netanyahu not giving enough of a mandate to the trio of senior people he has there, the head of the Shin Bet, head of the Mossad, and Nitzan Alon, a general who could easily have been a chief of staff and under a slightly different scenario. So these are very serious people. And Ehud Barak yesterday, the former prime minister, on television urged that they be given a true mandate to come up with the best deal that is attainable and to bring that back to the government for approval or rejection without the government micromanaging. And there is, of course, in the background here, because of the myriad skullduggery swirling around Netanyahu, suspicion, and even more than suspicion, that he is trying to drag his feet and to play for time for his own political purposes. And I don't discount that may be true, but as I look at the actual variables of the situation, what I see is that, as I said, the conceivable transition solution to a permanent ceasefire runs through a gamut that requires pressure on Hamas in this case and not Israel.
OK, Munir, you've heard there that Dan has talked about some of the parameters for a deal. Let's run through some of the things that have been discussed, because I mean, we're not getting a running commentary on any of this, but we're getting leaks repeatedly, and some of the things come up repeatedly. A 6-week ceasefire is what we hear, and then a phased release of those that are being held by Hamas and other groups. And we're talking apparently about the female, sick and elderly captives being released first. Is that your understanding of the first part of the deal?
I don't know, actually, what is going to be the first part of the deal. But what I know for sure is that we, I'm part of the Palestinian civil society. And what I would say is, no matter how many phases this deal is going to take, what is very important is that it ends with a ceasefire. The ceasefire is certainly the answer to and is the only way that the genocide can stop. This has been clear by understanding the way and the language of the International Court of Justice measures, provisional measures. This is also clear from the Security Council resolution that also called for a ceasefire. So the ceasefire is certainly a necessity in order
but Munir, just to interrupt there, the question is the timing of the ceasefire. The Security Council resolution actually refers to a ceasefire during Ramadan, and as you know, Ramadan is running out. It'll be over in a few days. The Israelis seem to be offering a 6-week ceasefire, or certainly that's been offered in the negotiations by either the Israelis or the US side. Hamas are saying a permanent ceasefire. What is the point you're making? What do you think Palestinian people are demanding?
Certainly permanent ceasefire. Gaza has been destroyed and people want to return back to their homes. We've experienced the temporary pauses of fighting during the first exchanges of prisoners. And we saw that Israel during that period prevented Palestinians from returning to Gaza City and to the north of Gaza City, not only to go back to their homes to live, but even to go and pick up some stuff in order to go back to the south with more of their stuff. Later on, Israel destroyed and burnt more and more houses and more facilities in the north of the Gaza Strip. What we see now as Palestinian civil society is that what Israel is doing is that it is emptying the north of Gaza totally from its residents. This is totally dangerous. If pauses are only happening for the exchanges so that the fighting will return later on in order to completely destroy the Gaza Strip and completely displace the Palestinians who continue to live in the Gaza Strip, as it has been clear to be the plan of the Israelis. That has not been even hidden. It has been published and talked about within Israeli media. This is something that is not acceptable. We, as human rights community,
Dan, sorry, you wanted to. Dan wanted to pick you up on something there, Dan.
Well, I mean, that is not the Israeli plan. The Israelis, the one need not overcomplicate. There is no big conspiracy theory. Israel wants Hamas to be deposed in Gaza. That's what they want. And they want the hostages back. There's no plan to depopulate Gaza, although some extremists in Israel have published their wishful thinking that way. No, that's not the plan. I would ask you, Munir, would you agree as a Palestinian to a permanent ceasefire that changes nothing from the current status quo, meaning it leaves Hamas in charge in Gaza? Is that for you? And Israel pulls out, Hamas is in charge, depleted, diminished, but in charge. You would be happy with this? With these
do you have an answer to his question, Munir? And then I'm going to continue answering the questions, asking them.
For me, Palestinian leadership should be only chosen by Palestinians and not by anybody else, not the Israelis and not anybody else in the world. However, what I want is that Israel pulls out immediately of the Gaza Strip. I want life to return back to the Gaza Strip. Israel has destroyed the Gaza Strip in a way and has continued with genocide that not only the court has found plausible, but also the Special Rapporteur on Occupied Palestinian Territory has said that it is actually happening, the genocide. I mean, there is all the evidence in the world that there is a genocide. I want the genocide to stop now. This is the most important that we have as Palestinians. Please stop the genocide.
Do you know the genocide convention? Definition of genocide. Definition of genocide is not a lot of people died. Definition of genocide is that there was an intent to destroy a people or a religious group. And that is not Israel's intent.
These are important questions. These are important questions, Dan, but they're not the questions that we're looking at. We're looking at a possible deal in Cairo. So, Dan, let me ask you this question: in terms of the Israeli side, obviously there's so much pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu to get the people that are being held by Hamas, to get them free, and we don't know they're all held by Hamas. Give us your understanding of how many people Israel believe are alive at this stage.
They believe they have a pretty good idea, and they believe that over half are alive. How much over half, I'm not sure they know. There are some they know are dead, some they think they know are alive, and there's a gray zone in between, but certainly a good number of them are no longer alive. And yeah, there's huge pressure on Netanyahu. You have to remember that Netanyahu is an unpopular prime minister. 75% of Israelis in all the polls say they want new elections very soon, and they want him gone. 2/3, roughly, appear to be ready to vote for parties that are not in the current coalition. If you remove the Haredi ultra-Orthodox religious extremist parties from the equation because they're automatically on his side, the numbers I just mentioned tell you that of the others, including Israeli Arabs, 90% want it gone. So that's the kind of pressure he's under. But on the other hand, it's not a presidential system, it's parliamentary. And in a parliamentary system, you might think that a disgraced government that has failed catastrophically and is clearly unpopular would resign. But technically speaking, as long as the 63 highly obedient coalition members that he has voting for him in the 120-seat parliament stick with him, he can drag things out until 2026. But the pressure is mounting, and the U.S. plays an enormous role here because the U.S. has leverage over Israel. And the U.S., by the way, has presented something really, really interesting that may be a way out of this sort of highly tactical discussion here of who is released at what week. There's something bigger going on. The U.S. is proposing that Israel stop playing games in a way that it's playing games and agree to the Palestinian Authority returning. Agree, something that Israel itself has been demanding since 2007. Agree perhaps to a multinational force, an Arab force in Gaza. Agree to talks that could last a long time on a two-state solution, and in return be part of a Sunni moderate Western U.S. NATO umbrella in the region, an alliance against Iran and its
Okay.
things. I mean,
let me bring in
Yes,
Hafsa on all this, because we're talking about the Cairo talks. Those are all things that are being floated by the US. They are not things, I would have thought, that are going to be in the scope of the discussion of what's going on around that table in Cairo, are they?
well, actually, I beg to differ.
Well, let's hear Hafsa on this.
I think the talks have been going on for so long, James, that everything is kind of blending into itself. And such is the lack of movement that with every round of talks, we get a new proposed peace plan. And Dan is not necessarily incorrect about what has been suggested and what has been thrown at a collection of the regional partners and states. I think it is perceived certainly as incredibly demeaning and condescending to have the United States and Israel concoct plans, shop them to Arab leaders and tell them that these are the only options at their disposal. That is certainly how the publics perceive them. Whether or not leaders from as far as, from Egypt across to the UAE want to entertain those, that will be their own prerogative, and they will face, and they are facing, their own forms of accountability and challenges domestically at home. However, the primary purpose of why all of this begins to blend in is because there is real acknowledgement, at least I think, that there cannot be a ceasefire arrangement until there is, or at least in terms of the permanent ceasefire arrangement, until there is some kind of resolution on the question of the day after and what that looks like. And there is a fundamental refusal and a fervent Arab public refusal to see Israel militarily occupy indefinitely the Gaza Strip and either condemn Palestinians to uninhabitable conditions and unlivable conditions that nobody would wish upon themselves in Rafah, in Khan Yunis, for those who remain in Gaza City and other parts, or offer them this long-held belief that any other Arab nation can simply take them and should take them, and this constant push-pull over the Sinai border or other parts of the region that can or should. And beyond that, who governs Gaza, how is Gaza governed, is inherently a part of these ceasefire talks. These ideas about Arab multinational forces and stuff, we know that these are serious plans being taken very seriously by the Americans. They were shopped. Part of the reason Blinken was across the region just 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, was to shop this exact plan to the Arab state leaders, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Saudis, and the Qataris, and the Emiratis, who were all in Cairo, or maybe the Qataris weren't, I can't remember. But the point being is that there is this unrealistic expectation or unrealistic understanding of how this conflict is playing out in the region, not just vis-a-vis Gazans themselves, but looking further beyond to occupied East Jerusalem, to occupied West Bank, the continuing dispossession. I think Dan is mistaken to say that this is merely a question about Hamas and a question about the Gaza Strip. There is a wider opportunism at play regarding annexation and regarding occupation that is continuing, such that Netanyahu and his allies would like to wait this out as long as possible. I think the only shift in this discourse and dynamic will come dependent on what the Iranian response is to the bombing of their embassy in Damascus a few days ago. And it's been made, certainly from what we understand, clear that the Iranians will strike and will strike in retaliation. And the Americans seem to be wanting to take a step back and avoid any direct US-Iran confrontation. Now, whether the broader risks of regional conflagration, things we've talked about, James, for over for over 6 months, in terms of the risks of this broadening out into a wider regional confrontation, now seek to become reality, or now start to be put into motion. And that slows down the military effort in the Gaza Strip and gives us a de facto lessening of the conflict dynamics, but nevertheless increased urgency on the humanitarian landscape is one possible scenario that would allow a delay of ceasefire talks, or would encourage maybe the Israelis and even Hamas to delay such talks as they look beyond the region.
if I can bring you in to comment on the developments of the last couple of days. We're told there was a very tense phone call between Biden and Netanyahu where he put real pressure on the Israeli leader. Also, you've got these promises from the Israelis that they're going to reopen the Erez crossing, they're going to have a temporary use of the port in Ashdod. How are these seen as by Palestinians? And are they seen as related in any way to these Cairo talks? I mean, diplomats talk about confidence-building measures, but in my experience, Israel prefers to use sticks rather than carrots.
Yes, but it's also Israel that is now starting to see carrots and sticks by the rest of the world. 2 days ago only, the Human Rights Council in Geneva, the United Nations Human Rights Council, issued a resolution calling for states to not to export arms and weapons to Israel. And this is very important. They also created a mechanism to see who is exporting weapons to Israel. This is also following the findings of the International Court of Justice, looking at Israel as a state that is plausibly conducting genocide. In addition to all the other evidence that we have a very active legal work, not only against Israel, but also against countries that are complicit with Israel. In the next few days, we will all witness the Nicaragua versus Germany case in the International Court of Justice, which actually blames Germany for exporting weapons to Israel while Israel is conducting genocide. This is actually a lot of pressure, not only on Israel, but also on the United States and on all the countries that have been complicit in the Israeli genocide in the Gaza Strip. So this is very significant in my opinion. It does apply pressure not only on Israel, but also on the countries that are supporting Israel. And this means that they will apply their own pressure on Israel. Now you can see there are several parliaments around the world that are calling their states to stop sending weapons to Israel.
Let me just bring in Dan towards the end of our discussion now, Dan, on the pressure on Israel, because on Prime Minister Netanyahu, there's internal pressure as well. Huge protests taking place across Israeli cities, particularly in Tel Aviv, and the body recovered of one of those that was being held in Gaza. How much pressure is the Israeli Prime Minister under, and do you think that in any way plays into the talks in Cairo?
Pressure on him is really from public opinion that might at some point reach the breaking point with his coalition. That could happen. He's generally unpopular. He was unpopular before October 7th because of his efforts to Putinize the country. But I think, Munir, you're sort of looking at the wrong tree, if not barking up the wrong tree. The ICJ is highly political and has no enforcement mechanism. They can say what they want. This is not a genocide. The Human Rights Council of the United Nations is a bit of a joke, generally run by dictatorships that don't respect human rights. No one pays attention. The real pressure points on Israel are something you alluded to at the end, which is Canada effectively slapping an arms embargo. Talk of such a thing by some people in Britain, and particularly the letter by 36 senators this week calling on Biden to put the squeeze on Netanyahu, which he did. But it won't go the way that my panelists are talking about. What Biden and the West want is for Netanyahu to say yes to the deal that, by the way, Hafsa, was not concocted by Israel and the U.S. because Israel opposes it, but by the U.S. and the West. And that deal might create real pressure on Israel. If Israeli society sees that in the offing is this grand design that includes peace with Saudi Arabia, then the pressure on Netanyahu to succumb to Hamas's terms might become irresistible, but even then I doubt it. And in any negotiation, you have to know what's important to the other side. You want to convince Israel of anything? You have to know what's important to them. Now, Netanyahu is Netanyahu, and he is a global historic singularity. But to the people of Israel, there's pretty much consensus that they cannot have Hamas in charge in Gaza anymore. Because Hamas spokesmen go on Arab television and say, we're going to do October 7th again and again and again. It ended the discussion. So Israel needs to know that Hamas will be replaced by the PA. Netanyahu may not want this, but that's what's going to happen anyway. If there are structures created to enable that. So honestly, if I was Qatar and Egypt and any Arab of good faith and any human being of good faith, I would be maximally pressuring Hamas to stand down and accept an exile deal where they go wherever. Hopefully Qatar can.
OK. Some pretty controversial comments there. I'm afraid we don't have time to pick you up on them, though. Thanks to all our guests, Dan Perry, Munir Munaseba and Hafsa Halawa.